His name was Lycomedes. It had once carried the wind of the Aegean Sea, the salt of the air, the laughter of other boys chasing a leather ball across the gray sands of Lesbos. Now the name was just a dry sound in his skull, a relic of a life ripped apart like an old papyrus scroll. He had been sold, not by his parents, who had been cut down by a Roman sword, but by a pirate who had considered his smile and olive eyes a few glittering denarii. The voyage on the slave ship was a cleansing through filth. He and dozens of other boys from Thrace, Gaul, Syria were crammed into the dark, dank hold. The air was a thick mixture of sour sweat, urine, feces, and fermenting fear. They lay huddled on top of each other, their bodies thin and shivering. Occasionally, a sailor with a matted beard and yellow teeth would descend, dragging one into the darkness. Faint screams would be drowned out by the creaking hull and the crashing of waves. Lycomedes learned his first lesson in silence. Silence was a flimsy shield. To be noticed was suicide. At Ostia, the Roman port, they were hauled onto deck. Sunlight stung their eyes after weeks of darkness. They were doused with cold seawater, scrubbed with rough brushes that scratched their skin. Then they were oiled to look sleeker, healthier, a delicate coating that hid their protruding ribs and bruises. A hot iron brand was branded into their shoulder blades. The searing pain knocked them unconscious for a moment, and when they woke, the smell of their own burning flesh still filled their nostrils. They were no longer Lycomedes. They were the property of Quintus Fabius Scaevola, a prominent slaver in Rome. The slave market in Rome was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a theater of despair. Slaves were displayed naked on wooden platforms. Potential buyers, portly aristocrats in white togas and veiled matronas, paced and examined. They pinched muscles, examined teeth, looked into eyes for a challenge they would later smother with delight. Lycomedes is classified as special goods. A nice boy. The delicate boys, the toys, he and a few other boys, whose skin was smooth, whose features were delicate, whose eyes still held a certain childish light, were kept separate. They were not completely naked. They were draped in thin linen sheets, enough to conceal but enough to tease. A small board around his neck read, "Greek by birth, 14 years old, can read and sing, untainted." The last line was a blatant lie, but a lie that sold. A man stopped at its platform. He was not as pudgy as the others. He was tall and thin, with a sharp face and eyes as cold as obsidian. His graying hair was neatly trimmed. His long, slender fingers bore a ring engraved with the wolf-suckling Romulus and Remus. He said nothing. He just looked, and that look stripped Lycomedes more than his clothes had. He felt like an insect pinned to a board. The merchant Scaevola hurried forward, bowing deeply. "Senator Marcus Licinius Crassus." "An honor, a great honor." Crassus did not look at Scaevola. His eyes remained fixed on Lycomedes. "Is he well?" His voice was low and even, without emotion. "Very healthy, Senator. Strong teeth, no disease, and intelligent. He can recite Homer to you while pouring Falernian wine." Crassus reached out a finger and touched Lycomedes' chin, lifting it up. His perfectly manicured fingernails scratched lightly at the skin. "Open your mouth," Lycomedes obeyed. His breath caught. Crassus looked inside, then nodded indifferently. "Is it obedient?" "My lord," Scaevola smiled obsequiously, "it will learn. Whatever it has not learned, our whips will teach it." Crassus withdrew his hand. "How much?" "For you, Senator." "A friendly price." 50,000 sesterti, a fortune, enough to buy a small farm." Crassus didn't even blink. He signaled to a slave to follow, who promptly produced a heavy bag of coins. The transaction was completed in less than a minute. Lycomedes' life was priced at a bag of metal. He was taken away from the marketplace, not to the squalid slave quarters, but to a luxurious curtained palanquin. Inside, he sat on silk cushions, huddled in a corner. He had no idea what awaited him, but the fear within him was worse than anything he had ever experienced in the hold. It was not the fear of random violence. It was the fear of deliberate, methodical cruelty. Crassus's residence was on the Palatine Hill, a marble and gold palace overlooking Rome. As he was led through its vast corridors, Lycomedes felt small and insignificant. The walls were decorated with brilliant frescoes depicting the gods performing acts of violence and lust. Zeus in swan form raping Leda, Apollo flaying Marsyas, Hades dragging Persephone to the underworld. These were not warnings. They were declarations. It was entrusted to an older man, another Greek slave named Helios, the steward of the mansion. Helios had a blank face and old scars on his back that showed under his shirt. He looked at Lycomedes not with pity, but with the weariness of someone who had seen this scene 100 times. "Your name doesn't matter now," Helios said in Greek, his voice dry. "The master will call you whatever he wants. Tonight, perhaps Ganymede. Tomorrow, perhaps Narcissus. You are a role. Remember that." Lycomedes was taken to a small room behind the kitchens. It had a bed of straw, a basin of water, and a curtain instead of a door. Helios gave it a soft white linen tunic. "Wash yourself," he commanded. "Use this oil." He set down a small earthenware jar. The scent of lavender and sandalwood drifted out, a luxurious and sickly scent. "Master hates the smell of slaves. He wants you clean." "Completely clean?" Helios paused at the makeshift doorway. "And boy, don't cry. Tears swell your eyes. They ruin your appearance. And don't resist. Resisting only makes things last longer and more painful. The sooner you accept that you are an empty vessel to be filled by your master, the less likely you are to break." When Helios left, Lycomedes stood alone in the small room. The silence of the palace was more terrifying than the screams on the ship. He stripped off his ragged, filthy clothes and looked down at his body. It was still the body of a boy, but it no longer belonged to him. It was a delivered commodity. He began to bathe, the cold water making his skin crawl. He scrubbed hard as if to wash away the marks of the iron, the touches of the merchants, the name Lycomedes, until all that remained was a blank surface, ready to be engraved. He did not know that the process had already begun. That night he was not called. He lay on his straw bed, listening to the distant sounds of the mansion. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses. Every footstep in the hallway made his heart pound. He could not sleep. He just waited. Waiting, he soon learned, was a form of torture. It was a gnawing of foreboding, a relentless tension that wore down the soul faster than the whip. And in that darkness, he began to understand. He was not bought to work. He was bought to be destroyed, slowly, methodically, for art. Life in Marcus Licinius Crassus's palace was a meticulously choreographed dance of obedience and quiet terror. Each day began before dawn, not with a rooster crowing, but with the ringing of a small bronze bell by another slave in the servants' corridors. Lycomedes and a dozen other boys in similar conditions would wake in their cold little cells. They had no common name, but in the slave underworld, they were known as roommates, the boys of the bedroom. A name that is both accurate and a cruel euphemism. Their world is confined to a private area of the mansion, a maze of narrow corridors and courtyards designed to keep them out of sight but always within reach. Here they are trained by Helios. This training does not involve learning useful skills like managing finances or overseeing a farm. It is an agenda that turns humans into functional ornaments. They learn to walk silently, their footsteps ghostly across the mosaic floor. They learn to pour wine from a heavy amphora into an exquisite goblet without spilling a drop, their wrists held at just the right angle to show grace. They learn to stand still for hours at a time at banquets, holding a silver platter or an oil lamp, their bodies becoming part of the furniture, living statues. They learn to smile hollowly when asked to and remain absolutely silent at all other times. Their voices are a privilege given by their masters, and just as easily taken away. A Gallic boy named Verson, who had been there for a year, made the mistake of speaking without permission. Crassus did not raise his voice. He simply signaled to one of his guards. Verson was dragged out. He returned the next day with his tongue cut out. He never spoke again, only making painful grunting noises when he tried to eat. It was a lesson more effective than any threat. The most brutal part of the training was sexual. It wasn't called that. Helios called it the art of pleasure. It was taught not through words, but through brutal practice. The older boys, the graduates, were ordered to guide the newcomers. It was a system designed to break down every last barrier to dignity and autonomy. The abuse was inflicted by other victims, a way to instill self-loathing and erase any possibility of solidarity. Lycomedes learned to endure the touch, to separate his mind from his body, to make himself into a soulless doll. He learned that the pain would pass, but the humiliation would take root, like a poisonous mold growing in the darkest corners of his soul. There was an elaborate hierarchy among the boys. Position was determined by age, beauty, and most importantly, the master's current favor. The favorite boy would wear better clothes, eat leftovers from Crassus's banquet table, and enjoy the dreaded privilege of sleeping on a mattress at the foot of his master's bed. The position was precarious. Crassus's favor was as fickle as the weather. A pimple, a mismatched look, a slight weight gain during puberty could get a boy rejected. Lycomedes, with her classical Greek beauty, quickly caught Crassus's eye. She was named Hyacinthus, after Apollo's young lover. Crassus liked to boast about his knowledge of Greek mythology, and his boys were pawns in his self-aggrandizing play. She was taught to play the lyre, her clumsy fingers running over the strings until they bled. She was made to memorize verses from Sappho, verses about love and desire that sounded cruelly ironic when spoken by a slave. Crassus was not always overtly violent. Sometimes his cruelty was more subtle. He would summon Lycomedes into his study and force him to kneel on the cold marble floor for hours while he read scrolls or wrote letters. He did not touch him, did not speak to him. He simply ignored him, his presence a mere reminder of his absolute power. In those moments, Lycomedes felt worse than the physical abuse. The feeling of invisibility, of being nothing more than a piece of furniture, ate away at his sense of self. The palace was a gilded cage. Everything was beautiful, the statues, the fountains, the fragrant gardens. But it was a deadly beauty. The boys were not allowed to leave their quarters unless summoned. The outside world existed only through what they could overhear. The sound of carriages on the cobblestone streets, the distant clamor of the Roman Forum. They were prisoners in a prison without bars, imprisoned by wealth and power. The relationships between the boys were complex. There were no real friendships, only temporary alliances based on survival. They silently shared information, how their host was feeling today, which guest was particularly dangerous, what kind of wine made him more violent. They learned to read the smallest signs, a frown, a twitch at the corner of Crassus's mouth. There was a Syrian boy named Amin, whose eyes always flashed with defiance. He tried to escape. He was caught after 2 days. Crassus made his punishment a spectacle for all the other slaves in the house. Amin was stripped naked and tied to a pillar in the main courtyard. Crassus personally beat him with a whip laced with bone and lead. Each blow tore flesh, blood streaming down the stone floor. Amin did not scream. He gritted his teeth and stared at Crassus until he lost consciousness. Then he was sold to the mines of Hispania, a slow death sentence. The message was clear, there was no escape. Something died in Lycomedes after that. Hope, even a glimmer, was extinguished. He realized that this was not a phase. This was his life. He began to observe and learn more seriously. He learned to anticipate Crassus's desires before he spoke them. He learned to become a mirror, reflecting back whatever he wanted to see: admiration, fear, desire. He became a great actor, but each night when he returned to his small room, the mask fell away. He would lie there, feeling the dull ache in his body and the emptiness in his soul. He would try to remember his mother's face, the smell of the sea, but those memories grew fainter, replaced by the smell of Crassus's perfume, the feel of his fingers on his skin, and the sound of his labored breathing in the darkness. The gilded cage had become his home, and he was slowly forgetting what it felt like to fly. He was being tamed, broken down, piece by piece, in the luxury and silence of Roman power. Dinner parties or symposia. The court parties at Crassus's palace were more than just social gatherings. They were stages where power, wealth, and decadence were brazenly displayed. For senators and other wealthy men, it was an opportunity to cement political alliances and flaunt their wealth. For boys like Lycomedes, it was the height of terror, a long night of servitude turned into public abuse. Such an evening began in a frenzy of preparation. Kitchen slaves hurriedly cooked dozens of sumptuous dishes: roasted peacocks, flamingo tongues, fresh oysters from the Bay of Naples. Other slaves decorated the dining room with fresh flower garlands, burning incense burners that gave off the strong scent of frankincense and myrrh. Lycomedes and the roommates others were subjected to a special purification ritual. They were bathed and shaved until their skin was red and sensitive. Then they were anointed with expensive perfumes and lightly made up. A touch of charcoal powder to darken the eyes, a touch of lead blush to redden the cheeks. They were dressed in delicate, almost transparent silk tunics imported from the Orient. They were not servants. They were part of the menu. When the guests arrived, Lycomedes stood by Crassus's divan, holding an ostrich feather fan. The guests were some of the most powerful men in Rome: Senator Lentulus, a fat man whose face was flushed from wine; General Galba, whose face was scarred by battle but whose eyes were ominously hungry; and a young poet named Ovidius, who was trying to curry favor with wealthy patrons with glossy flattery. They stretched out on the couches, propped up their elbows on their knees, and began to eat and drink. Lycomedes and the other boys moved silently among them, pouring wine, offering food, wiping their greasy fingers with damp towels. Their conversation was about politics, war, and money. But their eyes wandered. "Crassus," Lentulus said loudly, his mouth full of boar meat, "your new goods are beautiful. This Greek boy seems refined." He reached out a fat finger and poked Lycomedes in the side. Lycomedes flinched but did not dare move. Crassus smiled, a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "I believe in investing in beautiful things, Lentulus. Whether it be art or other things." "Can he recite poetry?" Ovidius asked, trying to sound polite. "A Greek soul in a Greek body, what a perfect combination." "Of course," Crassus replied. "Hyacinthus, please give our honored guests a passage from Anacreon." Lycomedes bowed his head, his heart pounding. He began to read, his voice shaky at first, then steady as he fell into the rhythm of the words. He read of love, of wine, of flowers. But every word was a lie, an insult to the original poem. He felt the men's eyes on him, not to listen but to judge. They were assessing his body, his lips, the trembling he tried to hide. As the meal continued and the wine flowed, the atmosphere became louder and more vulgar. Crude jokes were told, boasts of sexual conquest were made. Boys were no longer just pouring wine. They were pulled into laps, fondled, pinched. One younger boy, recently arrived from Bithynia, burst into tears when General Galba reached into his tunic. Crassus frowned. He gave the signal, and the boy was immediately whisked away by 2 guards. Everyone knew what would happen to him. His screams would be drowned out by the music and laughter. By midnight, most of the guests were drunk. Crassus, always frighteningly sober, stood up. "Gentlemen," he announced, "the main party is now beginning. The private rooms have been prepared." This was the signal. The ritual of power entered its final, most brutal phase. Each guest was free to choose a boy to companion for the night. It was not an offer. It was a right of the victor. Lentulus, his breath reeking of wine, grabbed Lycomedes by the arm. "I choose this one," he said to Crassus. Crassus nodded. "Go ahead. See to it that it serves you well." Lycomedes was dragged away, his legs almost giving way. He was pushed into one of the rooms. The bedrooms had no windows. The room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp. The air was hot and stuffy. The wall was painted with a picture of Priapus, the god of fertility, with a grotesquely large penis. What followed was a series of unspeakable acts of violence and humiliation. Lentulus, too fat and drunk to do it himself, called in 2 of his burly slaves. Lycomedes was pinned down, stripped naked. He was no longer human. He was a whole, a vessel for the drunken violence of a powerful man. The pain was excruciating, a feeling of being torn apart from within. But worse than the pain was the inhumanity of it. Lentulus laughed, gasping for breath, and gave crude instructions to his slaves. Lycomedes squeezed his eyes shut, biting his lip until it bled to keep from screaming. He tried to go somewhere in his mind, somewhere safe. The beach on Lesbos. But the image was tainted, invading. He had nowhere else to hide. So he simply turned it off. He detached himself from the tortured body on the bed. He became a distant observer, watching a strange boy being treated like an animal. This dissociation was his last defense mechanism. When it was all over, he was left alone on the blood-stained bed. Lentulus and his slaves had left, their laughter fading into the hallway. Lycomedes lay motionless for a long time, his body aching, his mind blank. Then a violent spasm rose from his stomach. He staggered out of bed and vomited on the floor. He vomited the wine and food he had served, vomited his humiliation, vomited the last remnants of himself. When he returned to the slave quarters at dawn, no one spoke. The other boys were returning as well, some limping, some with fresh bruises on their faces and bodies. They avoided eye contact. There was a silent complicity in their suffering. Sharing it would make it all too real. Silence allowed them to pretend the night had been a nightmare. Lycomedes washed himself in cold water, trying to wash away the smell of Lentulus, the smell of sweat and semen. But he could not wash it away. The smell was ingrained in his skin, in his memory. He put on a clean tunic and prepared for another day. Because the system never stopped. The ritual would be repeated, and he had to be ready to play his part again. He had learned a stark truth in that room. For men like Crassus and his friends, cruelty was not a byproduct of power. It was the goal. Time in Crassus's estate was not measured in days or months, but in the changing seasons and the fading of youth. Lycomedes entered the estate at 14, a tender bud. He remained there through 15, 16, 17. His body changed. He grew taller. His shoulders broadened. A fine down began to appear on his chin and upper lip. To a free-spirited youth, these were proud signs of maturity. To Annis boy, they are signs of obsolescence. Crassus's attention began to wane. He no longer called it Hyacinthus with fondness. His gaze swept over it, searching for the younger, softer faces brought in from newly conquered provinces. Lycomedes sensed this change as an animal senses the chill before a storm. Favor, though frightening, brought a measure of relative security. Losing it meant becoming useless, and useless things in Crassus's world were discarded. It had seen it happen to others. A Thracian boy, once Crassus's Adonis, was sold to a gladiator school when his beard grew too thick. Another was sent to work on Crassus's farms in Sicily, a slow death under the scorching sun. Their fate was a constant warning. Lycomedes' nightmare was no longer of nights spent in the bedchambers of Crassus or his guests. The new nightmare was of silence, of indifference. He tried desperately to attract attention, to be useful. He played the lyre better, recited more perfectly, served more quietly. But he was trying to sell a product that had already expired. On its 18th birthday, a day only it remembered, the end came. It was summoned by Helios to Crassus's office. Crassus was sitting behind his ebony desk, examining accounts. He did not look up when Lycomedes entered and knelt. "I have decided your future," Crassus said indifferently, his eyes still fixed on the papyrus. "You have served me adequately. As a reward for that service, and because I am in a generous mood, I will release you." Lycomedes was stunned. Freedom? A word he had not dared to think in years. A wave of mixed emotions washed over him, shock, disbelief, and a small, painful glimmer of hope. "However," Crassus continued, finally looking up, and his cold smile extinguished that glimmer of hope immediately, "freedom comes with obligations. You will work for a business associate of mine, a moneylender named Fulvius. He needs a scribe who knows Greek. You will have room and board. A generous arrangement for someone like you." Lycomedes understood. This was not freedom. This was an elegant transfer of property. He would no longer be Crassus's slave, but would be forever indebted to him, bound by a patronage system. Crassus was discarding an old toy, but ensuring it would be useful somewhere else. That day, Lycomedes left the villa on the Palatine Hill. He had nothing but the clothes he was wearing and the scrolls certifying his release. As he stepped out the gates, breathing the air of Rome as a nominal free man, he felt no joy. He felt empty and lost. The villa, for all its horrors, had been the only world he had known for 4 years. The outside world was strange and terrifying. The life of a freed slave, lived a life in between. He was no longer a slave, but he could never be truly free. The shadow of his past clung to him like an indelible stain. People looked at him and saw not Lycomedes the scribe, but Crassus's boy. Whispers, contemptuous looks, mocking smiles followed him through the streets. He worked for Fulvius in a cramped, stinking room in the Subura, the slums of Rome. His job was to record loans and payments. He worked mechanically, his mind often drifting. The sounds of the city, the shouts of vendors, the clatter of cartwheels on stone, often turned to laughter in Crassus's dining room, the slap of flesh in the windowless room. He couldn't form relationships. He trusted no one. The touch of another person, even a friendly pat on the shoulder, startled him. He tried going to a brothel once, thinking he could regain control of his body by being the buyer instead of the sold. But when he was with a girl, all he felt was nausea. He saw Lentulus, Galba, Crassus's face in her eyes. He ran out into the street and vomited in an alley. His body was free, but his mind was still chained. His nights were filled with nightmares. He would wake up screaming in a cold sweat, the feel of the demonic hands still on him. He started drinking. Cheap, harsh liquor that burned away memories in a matter of hours. Years passed. Lycomedes grew old. The beauty that had once been his curse faded, replaced by wrinkles and a permanent weariness. He remained a scribe, a nameless ghost in the vast city. Occasionally he heard news of Crassus, a successful speech to the Senate, a new military conquest. Each time his invisible scars throbbed. He never told his story to anyone. Who would believe? And even if they did, who would care? His story was but a drop in the ocean of suffering on which the Roman Empire was built. The foundations of marble temples, mighty aqueducts, and celebrated laws were mixed with the bones and tears of millions like him. On a cold winter evening, Lycomedes, now a middle-aged man with graying hair, sat alone in his rented room. He looked out the window, watching the snowflakes fall on the dirty rooftops of Rome. He had no family, no friends, no legacy. Crassus and others like him would be remembered in history. Their names would be etched in stone. Their actions, however brutal, would be analyzed by scholars for centuries. But what of Lycomedes? What of Vercin, whose tongue was cut out? What of Amin, who died in the mines? What of the countless other boys whose names were forgotten as soon as they were coined? History has no place for them. They are nothingness, the silence between the lines of great men. And in that silence, in the echoes of his life's ashes, Lycomedes finally understood the final, cruelest truth. They had taken more than his body. They had taken his story. They had erased him from the world. Total annihilation was not death at all. It was oblivion. And in that cold room, he realized he had died long ago, the day he was sold in that market, under the gaze of a Roman senator. The rest was just a ghost waiting to fade away. The story of Lycomedes is not an anomaly. It is not the tragedy of a single individual falling into the hands of a rare monster. The real tragedy and the most horrifying truth is that his story is one of normal. It was the mass-produced product of a gigantic, efficient machine, oiled by the highest Roman ideals. That machine did not merely destroy bodies. It was designed to erase their very existence from human memory. To understand why the screams in the rooms never recorded, we must dismantle the machine itself, each rusted and bloody part. Pillars of philosophy, the virtue of the ruler. The greatest paradox of the Roman elite lies here. A society obsessed with concepts such as virtue, masculinity, courage, gravitas, dignity, seriousness, and discipline is the breeding ground for ultimate decadence. But for them, this is not a contradiction. It is an affirmation. Stoic philosophers like Seneca the Younger, who wrote profound essays on compassion, self-control, and human dignity, also owned hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves. He wrote, "Do unto your inferiors as you would have your superiors do unto you." But his concept of human had clear limits. Slaves, legally and philosophically, were ares an object, wenevical instrument a talking tool. Therefore, using the tool in any way the owner sees fit is not considered an ethical act. but a matter of property management. Crassus's actions were not seen as cruelty, but as a demonstration of the power of the Lord, the absolute power of the master. This power was considered the foundation of the Roman social order. How could a man who could not control his family and slaves control a legion or govern a province? Domination in the home was a training ground for domination on the world stage. Subduing a boy in bed was also practice for subduing a Gaulish tribe on the battlefield. Both were acts of assertion virtue of the Romans, my will on the world. The sexual abuse of male slaves was not considered homosexuality in the modern sense. Roman society was not concerned with the gender of the subject, but with the role. A free Roman citizen in the active penetrative role could have sex with anyone, women, male slaves, prostitutes, without compromising his masculinity. By contrast, the passive penetrative act was considered the ultimate degradation, turning a man into a woman, a slave. Thus, when Crassus abused Lycomedes, he was not simply satisfying his lust. He was performing a ritual of power, repeatedly asserting his position as the ruler and turning Lycomedes into a symbol of absolute submission. Roman philosophy did not condemn this act. It provided the theoretical framework for it. Architecture of silence. The Roman villa was a masterpiece of social engineering, designed to radically separate public and private life. Public life took place in the front of the house, atrium, where the host welcomes guests, customers, customer protege, and tablinum, offices where business transactions were conducted. These spaces were decorated to publicly display wealth and power. But behind, deeper within the structure of the mansion, is another world. Through peristyle columned courtyards, one will find private areas, and hidden within these areas are the rooms. These rooms, as Lycomedes experienced them, were often small, windowless, and had only one entrance. They were architectural black boxes. What happened inside stayed inside. Thick walls, often soundproofed with layers of plaster and sometimes lead, ensured that the sounds of suffering did not leak out into the main hallway. The manning of the mansion also contributed to this silence. Slaves like Helios, the steward, were the gatekeepers of the secret. Their loyalty was assured by a combination of fear and a position of relative privilege. They knew that revealing their master's secrets would result in a death worse than what happened in the bedrooms. They became the enforcers, the maintainers of the system that imprisoned them. Even the art on the walls was part of the machine. The frescoes of gods abducting and raping were not merely decorative. They were a sophisticated form of brainwashing. They normalized sexual violence, cloaking it in myth and culture. If Jupiter, king of the gods, could abduct the young Ganymede to be his cupbearer and lover, how could a Roman senator not do the same? Art transformed crime into tradition, decadence into sophistication. The economy of the flesh. This machine needed fuel, and that fuel was a constant supply of young bodies. The Roman slave economy was a vast and complex network, and the trade in lovely children is a specialized and extremely profitable niche. Supplies came from all over the empire. Military conquests brought tens of thousands of prisoners, including children. Famine-stricken provinces were another source where desperate families would sell their children to survive. Pirates, like the one who had taken Lycomedes, operated along the sea lanes, kidnapping the unlucky. These children were then taken to major slave trading centers such as Delos, Ephesus, or Rome itself. There, Themangones, slave traders, would sort them. Healthy children would be sold to mines or farms. Children with the potential to become delicate will be treated differently. They were perfected as luxury items. They were fed special diets to keep their skin smooth. They were taught the basics of Greek literature and music, as Greek culture was considered the pinnacle of sophistication by the Roman elite. They were taught how to move, how to talk, or not talk. Themangones' doctors were even hired to remove physical defects. In extreme cases, they could be castrated to maintain a youthful appearance and high-pitched voice, a practice that some later emperors particularly favored. Prices were determined by a number of factors. Age, the younger the more expensive. Origin, Greeks and Egyptians were prized for their classical beauty. Skill, music, poetry, and most importantly, virginity, though often fake. A top-notch boy could cost more than a thoroughbred racehorse or even a small villa. It was a speculative market where human flesh was valued as a commodity. This economy ensured that for every boy ruined and discarded by someone like Crassus, there were hundreds more lined up to replace him. Legacy of scars. Willful forgetting. So why do we know so little about these stories? Why is history silent? Because history is written by the victors, the rulers. The surviving texts from the Roman period, poems, letters, speeches, historical works, were written almost entirely by men of Crassus's class. When they refer to these boys, they use euphemisms and euphemisms. They call them luxury joy, love's love, or sicaro, little bird. These words mask the stark reality of exploitation, transforming it into something sentimental, almost poetic. The poet Martial wrote short poems about his serving boys, but he wrote about them as if they were lovable pets, not human beings imprisoned in a system of sexual abuse. The victims' voices, on the other hand, were completely silenced. They were not educated to write. They had no means to record their experiences. Their stories were told not in ink on papyrus, but in the scars on their bodies and souls. And when they died, their stories died with them. Even when a man like Lycomedes is freed, he is still silenced by society. One freed being a sex slave carried a heavy stigma. His testimony in court would be doubted. He would be ridiculed and shunned. Trying to tell the truth about someone as powerful as Crassus would be suicidal. The only way to survive was to stay silent, to try to blend in, to try to forget. The silence we face when we look back on history is therefore not an accident. It is the end result of the machine. It is a silence deliberately constructed, enforced by power, rationalized by philosophy, financed by economics, and sealed by shame. We can excavate mansions, find rooms hidden, and gaze upon the fading frescoes. But we shall never hear the cry. We shall never feel the horror. Roman history, for all its grandeur, is built upon a foundation of nameless graves, and the machine of forgetting goes on its work, grinding their last echoes into dust.